And let me just say thank you for the introduction. Uh, Thank you for the invitation to share. As I was introduced, I am Dr. Lamar Hardwick. Um, I am a recently retired pastor. I retired or semi-retired at the end of 2023 due to ongoing cancer treatments that I've been in since 2020. But I am doing relatively well. And so I'm thankful for that. I do have a doctorate of ministry, and I'm currently pursuing a PhD in ethics. But my primary research over the last few years has been on the intersection of disability, race, and religion, primarily Christianity and Western culture. When I say Western, primarily in uh, America, but with some studies also in, um, the North America, including Canada. So, I know the hour is late, and so I just want to share maybe an overview of my research and how it impacts a lot of what has been discussed today. But I am a storyteller. As a pastor, even though I'm not pastoring, I'm still a preacher at heart, and so I'm a storyteller. So I want to just tell a quick story. There's a story of a woman who uh, fell ill, and unfortunately, she passed away. And she ended up going to heaven. Now, when she got to heaven, she got to the gate, and Peter was at the gate, and she asked Peter, how do I get into this place? And she's seeing, behind the gate, it seems like there's a party going on. Her family and friends are waving her in, and Peter says, "Oh, it's easy. All you have to do is just spell one little word." And she says, "Oh, what's the word?" He says, "Love." And she says, "Oh, that's easy. Love." And he says, "Great. Welcome to heaven." Well, a few years pass by, and she runs into Peter again, and he looks frantic. And he grabs her and says, "Hey, can you watch the gate for me today? I'm really busy with some other projects I have going on." And so she says, "Sure." He says, "Now remember, if anyone shows up, just make sure that they spell the word." And she says, "Love." He says, "Absolutely." So watch the gate for me. If anyone shows up, have them spell the word. Well, after a couple of hours, her husband shows up. And he sees his family and friends waving him in. It looks like everyone's having a good time. And she sees him and says, "Oh my God, it's so good to see you. But before I let you in, tell me about some of the things that happened on Earth after I died." And he says, "Well, you're not going to like this, but you know how you and your sister look a lot alike? About 6 months after you died, I married your sister." And she says, "Oh, really?" And she says, "Well, what else happened after I died?" And he says, "Well, you're not going to like this either, but about 6 months after I married your sister, we played the lottery and won and hit and won $150 million." And she says, "Oh, really?" And he says, "Enough about me. How do I get into this place?" And she says, "Oh, it's really simple. All you have to do is spell one little word." And he says, "Well, what's the word?" And she says, "Czechoslovakia." Now, I can't hear you, but I assume some of you at least are laughing. It's a humorous story that I like to tell before I start my presentation, because much of what we're going to say, if you push aside any religious connotations, heaven is sort of synonymous with the ideal, and so we even use it as an adjective. This ice cream is heavenly. This view is heavenly, because it sort of represents in our culture what we see as the ideal. And a lot of what I'm going to discuss today is built off of um, the ideal that there are ideals that our culture holds, our society holds, and it shapes how we understand disability, how we understand race, but it also begs us to ask the question, who is allowed to set the language for those ideas? Who are the gatekeepers that stand in between those of us uh, and those of us who want to reach the ideal and those of us who are inside of the ideal? And so just keep that in mind as we progress through this presentation. Now, as it was stated in the beginning, my most recent book is called How Ableism Fuels Racism. It's already won an award, and Publishers Weekly gave it a star review, which is a book of high distinction. And so you can order it on that QR code there. But let's move on. So first, I want to make a note about language. I know in the disability community there are several philosophies about language. One would be person first, in which we put the person before the disability. And then the second would be identity first, in which there are those who believe that their disability is a part of their identity. And so they use it in the identity first language. And so an example of that would be, as it was stated before, I'm known online as the autism pastor. That's because I was diagnosed with autism very late, at age 36. Um, but if you were to describe me, or if I was to describe myself, person first language would say that I am a person with autism. Identity first language would say that I'm an autistic person. And so you see the difference there. And I make a note about this language because I believe in honoring those who choose to identify and use whatever language that they believes best describes them and their experience. And so, so that people are not offended, you might hear me interchange or go back and forth between those two different ways of discussing disability. So just make a note of that. And that's just my way of honoring those who use either person first or identity first. Now, I want to start off by naming two high profile cases of young unarmed black men who were killed in the last recent couple of years. The first is Ahmed Arbery. Um, we know about him after his case became national news. But in the beginning, his case almost did not make the news at all because the two people who will later be charged with his murder were allowed to describe the incident as a case of self-defense. And because um, of the privilege of them being two white men in South Georgia, they were given the benefit of the doubt. And so that case actually did not, uh, those two individuals did not receive any charges until several months later when a video came out that showed exactly what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. He was never found to have a weapon. And they were eventually, those two men and the person who recorded the video of him jogging and him being chased down and shot to death, they all three were eventually charged with his murder. And then on the right, you have Elijah McClain, who lived in Aurora, Colorado. Was walking home one night after visiting a convenience store, and he had on a ski mask. Someone very innocently thought it was odd, called 911. We later found out that Elijah had a condition that caused him to be anemic, and so it was not unusual for him to walk around with warm clothes on in spring and even summer months because of his condition. Now, in my book, I noted that Elijah was autistic, which was the information that was provided at the time of his death. I have been told since then that that information has been recanted, but in my book, based on my research and the available information at the time, he was known to be someone who was autistic or an autistic person. He eventually was made contact with police. They wrongly assumed that he was on some type of drug, and they called in the paramedics who gave him a lethal dose of ketamine, which is a sedative. Elijah was given some that was 3 to 4 times, some for someone his weight, and he eventually had a heart attack and died. Now, why is this important? And what does this have to do with both ableism and racism? And I start off with these two stories in my book because I think that what we have seen in our country, and we know the history of racism, is that we have wrongly made an assumption about the origins and the reasons for racial slavery, which led to a lot of racial segregation and racial discrimination in our country. And the root cause of that is actually ableism. And so implicit bias strongly shapes the treatment of people of color in the U.S. judicial system, according to the New York Civil Liberties Union and the NYPD from 2002 to 2011. They conducted stop and frisk procedures on millions of citizens, about 90% of those being Black and Hispanic, 88% of those minorities who the police profiled and stopped had no weapons or contraband at all. And so we know that these are not new issues or new stories that I'm telling you. And so what I did in my research, which eventually became the book, is I discovered that our issues with racism are in fact issues of ableism. And if we want to be honest, American Christianity has played a significant role in influencing ableism in our present culture and context. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the religious aspect of my research, but I will point out times where the moralization of certain issues were the result of religious rhetoric. Now, I want to go through what I call ableism defined, and then ableism displayed to give a broader view of what ableism is so that we can understand how it impacts race in our country and how that impacts some of the institutions that we actually built around this system of ableism and racism. And so the ableism is defined as the practice of discriminating against people with disabilities based on the belief that normal, quote unquote, normal bodies are superior to those that are not. And so I put normal in quotations because those definitions may vary, but oftentimes those definitions of what it means to be normal come from sources that are actually trying to define disability by way of deficit. And so we use normal as a quote unquote standard for what a body is supposed to look like, how a body is supposed to operate, how a mind is supposed to operate. And ableism is discrimination based on the belief that those ideas about what it means to be normal and have normal bodies and minds, that those bodies and minds are superior to those that are not quote unquote normal. And so, if we look at ableism, it's rooted in a series of ideals that shape ideas about body normativity, intellectual competence, beauty, and perceived value. And so, ableism is also a hierarchy of bodies and by default, also bodies at work. Now, let me pause and say something about that because that is often something that is missed as we discuss ableism. And so when I say ableism is a hierarchy of bodies and by default also bodies of work, what I mean there in my book and what I found in my research is that not only are certain bodies and minds considered to be normal or superior, which means certain bodies and minds are found to be inferior. What I discovered is not just those bodies are considered inferior, but the bodies of work that proceed from those communities. So, for example, we often have a difficult time in disability work, and more specifically in my area of disability theology, as we talk about religion. We also always have a difficult time being taken seriously because disability is not just about ranking the bodies, but also the bodies of work. And so, bodies of work that come from disabled bodies or disabled minds are oftentimes considered inferior because of the bodies and because of the types of minds that produce the work. It is automatically, by default, considered inferior. So that's what I mean by bodies of work. And then we also have to consider when we define ableism that the quote unquote right bodies are often considered the most beautiful and what is considered the most believable. And that's important when it comes to issues such as law enforcement, different industries, healthcare, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we proceed throughout the presentation. Now, ableism displayed oftentimes is an assigned social and economic designation to which some bodies are unable to escape. And so we'll see throughout history as ableism fuels racism, that it's actually a social and economic designation. And so it's not just, for lack of a better term, people who discriminate against disabled people because they don't like disabled people. It's actually a social and economic designation. And so those bodies and minds are often socially and economically unable to escape that designation that extends beyond just mean comments or looking at disabled people as less than. It is actually impacts them socially and economically. Now, ableism also determines which bodies belong. And so the reason why I begin with the stories of Ahmed Arbery and Elijah McClain is because whether or not people realize it, we're all swimming in ableism and the ideas in which it has the ways in which it's inserted itself into our society. And so when you look at what happened to Ahmed Arbery, um, the reason why he was murdered is because those two white men thought that his body did not belong in the area that it was in, namely him jogging through a neighborhood in which high-end houses were still being built. And that's what ableism does. It determines which bodies belong, and it also determines where certain bodies belong. Again, and so both him and Elijah McClain, um, maybe not intentionally, but subconsciously, it was assumed that their bodies did not belong where they were at the time. Ableism also determines what behaviors are quote unquote normal. And so that plays into the story of Elijah McClain, who because of his behaviors, because of him wearing a ski mask in warm weather, because of a condition or a disability that he had that caused him to be cold constantly. Uh, Ableism determines that that's not a quote unquote normal behavior, even though it's normal for him. And so we see that oftentimes with other disabilities, whether it is an intellectual disability, some sort of behavioral or mental health issue. Ableism subconsciously determines what behaviors are normal, and it also then assumes the right to determine which behaviors are dangerous. And so you see the result of that with Elijah McClain. Some of his behaviors uh, were interpreted as dangerous because of the fact that he had conditions that persons thought were quote unquote not normal. And so also ableism assumes incompetence and it assumes that different equals deficient. And so that's the ways that you see ableism actually work in society. And it's important to know that because I think we have a pretty broad definition of ableism, and it's good, but we don't actually understand oftentimes how it is displayed in our society. Now, when I talk about in my book, Ableism Fueling Racism, I break it down to what I call the big three of American bias. And so what I found in my research is that it boiled down essentially to what I call, especially as I was particularly relating it to the intersection of religion, race, and disability. I named the first of the three of American biases, the initial sin. Again, we won't talk much about religion in this presentation, but that's how I named it in my book. The second of the big three is images and idols. And the third of the big three is institutions. And so I'll share uh, just an overview of those three. And so I won't share in depth for time's sake, but we will talk about those three at an overview. And so the first is initial sin. And we all know the horrific story of the transatlantic slave trade, which I name as the initial sin of American bias. And the reason why that's the initial sin or the initial wrong that was committed of um, American colonization is, often that we understand the transatlantic slave trade and the horrific uh, treatment of enslaved Africans. But we also have to understand that there was, as a process of that, a normalization of chattel slavery. Um, a normalization of chattel slavery meant that there had to be a way in which people began to frame what was happening during the transatlantic slave trade as a normal part of the creation of the colonies and a normal part of the ways in which this new world was going to be built and progressed. And so there was a normalization of chattel slavery that was also part of America's initial sin or initial wrong. Now, part of that normalization was actually very both religious and more so political. If you look throughout history, you'll find documents, and this is actually something that you can find online in its entirety. Is George Fitzhugh's now infamous defense of slavery, Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters? And in it, Fitzhugh argues that slavery is humane and morally permissible. And so, what Fitzhugh does in that document is he begins to talk about how enslaved Africans or black bodies were actually in need of white supervision because they were inherently disabled. Now, in the beginning, it was a conceptual type of disability, meaning that Fitzhugh, along with many others, including the medical profession, began to create a variety of diagnoses that they believed enslaved Africans had that caused them to be mentally incompetent and in need of white supervision in order for them to thrive as a society and as a group of people. And so, what began actually, though, as a conceptual type of disability began to morph into actual physical disabilities because of the inhumane treatment that enslaved Africans received. And so as slavery progressed, because of the torture and because of the beatings, a lot of enslaved Africans begin to have physical disabilities and ailments that became a part of the slave trade. Fitzhugh actually, in his this document, paved the way for developing the use of disability to define blackness. And so here's where you begin to see the intersection of race, religion, and disability, because Fitzhugh, beginning with a conceptualization of disability and a defense of and a definition of disability, they began to attach that primarily to enslaved Africans, which in turn began to attach disability as a concept and also as a definition and a reality to Black bodies. And so what you begin to see is this idea that Black bodies were inherently disabled. And again, it became not just a concept, but a lived reality, but also a social and economic designation to which they were unable to escape. And this was done to further raise political and social support for racial slavery. And then Fitzhugh's work helped introduce what end up being called the positive good argument, which built on Fitzhugh's work, stating that slavery was actually a good thing, and actually not just a good thing, but a moral thing because of the fact that all Black bodies and minds were inherently disabled, according to Fitzhugh's work. And so you see that this argument in history was later popularized by Senator John C. Calhoun, which then made this as much of a political issue as it was a racial, medical, and religious issue. So the second of the three American biases was images and idols. And what you begin to see is the development of images, and I also call them idols, that were conceptually erected in order to be able to have great social, religious, medical, and economic definitions of what it meant to be normal. And so, what I say images and idols, uh, in order for disability to be properly understood as a concept, especially as it was being attached to an entire race of people, had to have images of what it meant to be normal, what it meant to be healthy, what it meant to be beautiful. And so you started to see erection of things like the ugly laws. And I'll speak a little bit more about that. But then also that helps us to also understand the inner workings of that conception of disability as it's attached to a racial designation, as we see what's called the politics of desirability. And so ableism and attractiveness have had a long-standing connection in our national history. In the late 1800s, cities began passing ordinances aimed at reducing the number of quote unquote unsightly beggars in their communities. And the term unsightly was a euphemism for disability, particularly physical disabilities that people deemed offensive. Now, this wasn't just relegated to Black bodies, it also meant anyone who was physically disabled. In fact, the earliest set of immigration laws were defined by disability, who was physically able to work and to produce in the New World as they began to build the colonies. Disability was a huge impact on even immigration. The site of the longest standing set of what would eventually become known as the ugly laws in the country was San Francisco. And in 1867, the city introduced a subset of laws designed to discourage street begging. Now, by adding stipulations about quote unquote certain people to the begging ordinance, San Francisco effectively passed a law that attached disability to definitions of beauty and attractiveness. And this made it unlawful for any person who was quote unquote diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed to appear in public. And eventually, let me go back. Eventually, Chicago and New Orleans would implement their own versions of ugly laws, and they began to actually spread throughout the country, attaching disability to definitions of beauty, attractiveness, and once again, also attaching disability to race. Now, the politics of desirability is defined as the influence of desire and attractiveness in a contemporary culture. And so, what we see is that disability politics suggests that the social ideas that shape systems of power and control and often quietly lead to intentional or unintentional oppression. So, what I found is that the closer one is to being found desirable by social standards, the more access they have to resources, power, and privileges that make their life easy. Obviously, the inverse of that is the furthest that one is away from being found desirable, which included disability, which also meant that those who were black were considered undesirable because they were also considered inherently disabled. The further that they were away from what was desirable, the more difficult it was to access resources, power, and privileges that make their life easy. And so desirability and attractiveness are not always merely about physical appearance. I want to make a note about that. But more often than not, they significantly shape how we are taught to treat people. And I say treat people in the present because we still operate on a system of desirability and attractiveness. And so, disability, skin color, gender, sexual identity, weight, education, and even nationality, and many other things are all factors that determine a person's desirability. And so the politics of desire and ability is a dangerous collection of ideals that taint religion, employment, politics, law enforcement, education, and healthcare, and many other institutions and industries. And so when we talk about institutions, I won't go into a lot of detail. Um, there are, oh, let me go back. My apologies. There are a lot of institutions that I found that were more highly impacted by some of the research and finding how Black bodies were considered inherently disabled. Um, People who were considered desirable, which included, um, or rather, people who were considered undesirable in society, which included the disabled, which automatically included Black bodies and Black minds, but also began to also include women, immigrants, anyone else who was considered undesirable found themselves with barriers or gates, as I started the story with this presentation with this story. They found themselves being victims of gatekeepers to the type of resources, education, and access that other people seemed to enjoy because they were considered more desirable. And so there are lots of various institutions. Religion was is one that was not just impacted, but religion actually had a large hand in controlling uh, a lot of the ways that people with disabilities and people who were Black were seen by the greater society, because people like Fitzhugh, Senator Calhoun, eventually other religious leaders were those who led the charge in actually defining what disability was, defining, using that definition to decide who was disabled, and then consequently deciding who was desirable because of those definitions, and really the way that they constructed idols and images about what a normal body and a normal mind was. And so you'll see a religion, you'll see in my book, I talk about how employment was impacted and continues to be impacted by these images and idols of what it means to be normal, what it means to be a productive worker. One of the ways that we saw this was through COVID and the change of the image of what it meant to be a productive worker. And what I mean by that is that um, remote work became a viable option for a lot of institutions and employment agencies because they were willing to change the image or the idol that was erected about what it meant to be a productive employee. Now, this actually positively impacted people with disabilities, and subsequently positively impacted uh, Black people and all those others that were considered undesirable. But notice that that change was not done in order to give them access and resources. It was done to continue the capitalistic agenda of our country. And this is not a new way of operating in our country, because usually whatever serves the able-bodied population is what is done in order to make sure that they continue to have access to the resources and the relationships that are needed for them to excel. It just so happened that during COVID, it actually also positively impacted the disabled and the undesirable. It's also impacted areas of education. Healthcare is one thing that I talk about in the book. Ways that you can see that displayed is the maternal mortality rate in this country as it pertains to Black women. And you saw various high profile cases of Black women dying during childbirth because they weren't believed and they weren't taken seriously, but also because there is still ideals on the books about what it means to be a healthy person. And in the book, I talk about some of those ideals come from. One quick um, incident that I talk about, or individual rather, that I talk about in the book, is John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg from the Kellogg family, the cereal family. He was both an influential religious leader and influential in the healthcare system because he was a surgeon. He eventually stepped down from his religious positions, and he actually invented a system for determining what a healthy body would look like in the eves of the end of slavery and the beginning of segregation, because he wanted to ensure the existence of the white race, because he believed that white people would outlive blacks who were now freed because they were inherently disabled and inherently unhealthy. And so the system that he created, which we still use some of those measurements today, was actually designed to define what a healthy white woman should look like. And so things like BMI and other things that we use to measure health, those were actually created to actually ensure the existence of the white race by defining what a healthy white woman should look like. They were never designed for the mass of society. And so you can see there where both the initial sin, the images and idols of what it meant to be normal and healthy, impacted the institution of healthcare. But you also see it in law enforcement, and that was given in the two examples at the beginning of this presentation. And so, a couple of ways as I wrap up to think about um, actually working against ableism and racism in our institutions is to always presume competence, especially as we encounter individuals that we may know or may present as disabled, particularly if they have a intellectual disability. One of the things that would have saved Elijah McClain's life is if the officers presumed competence and presumed that Elijah knew what he was talking about in his responses to them, rather than assuming that because he was black, he was on drugs. But also to uh, understand that there is also behind the scenes working this idea of ableism and how it presumes which bodies belong in certain places and which behaviors are normal and not normal. And in his case, it presumed which behaviors were dangerous, which actually led to the end of his life. Another way is to always avoid paternalism, to not assume, even if you believe or someone presents as disabled, that they're not in need of your intervention unless that is requested. Another way is to provide, and this is very important, to provide inclusive images of healthy, productive, and educated people. And so that means in all of our institutions, not just education and healthcare, is how can we provide inclusive images of what it means to be a healthy, quote unquote, normal person, as we seek to sort of destroy those images and idols that were created by that initial sin. How do we produce and provide inclusive images? I would also say in all of those industries and institutions that I mentioned, and even others, is to have regular awareness, acceptance campaigns for both ableism, awareness and acceptance campaigns, rather, for both ableism and racism. How do we help people to understand ableism? How do we help them to understand the subtle ways in which ableism informs the way that they view the world and the ways that they view race, and even in some cases, if you view people's immigration status, how they view gender or sexuality, and various other things. Think about creating advocacy councils in our institutions and in our systems, people who can help advocate for or be available to advocate for those who request assistance in situations where they feel like ableism or racism or sexism or the like is being used against them within that institution. This was also important as I wrap up. Be curious about the origins and the objectives of health and employment standards and measurements. And what do I mean by that? There are a lot of, as I mentioned before, standards and measurements that are on the books of what it means to be healthy, that did not begin with the origin of assuming that those measurements were meant for all types of bodies and minds. So again, John Harvey Kellogg is a great example of that, by creating a measurement of health that was uh, or that originated as a use for ensuring the legacy of the white race. So we need to be curious about where those standards and measurements come from, and what are their origins and what are their objectives. Even for employment, why do we use the standards and measurements that we do to measure what it means to be productive? Because we saw during COVID that those things can be adjusted when it serves able-bodied populations or it serves a capitalist agenda. But that also means that they can be scrutinized and redeveloped in ways that help to meet the needs of a variety of people who have been considered disabled or undesirable. And then finally, recreate accurate and culturally appropriate tools of measurement. And so all the tools that we use are not accurate or culturally appropriate tools of measurement because they do not include, or they were not, their origins weren't, and their objectives were not to allow those who are outside the gate to gain access to the types of privileges and relationships and resources that make life easier for those who are considered undesirable. And so, as I wrap up, here's just a few resources that you can use to continue. That you can use to continue to further your reading. I didn't give too much because I didn't want to overwhelm you with a lot of reading. But if there's any questions about that, certainly get in contact with me and I can provide you with additional resources. And so I believe at this time we can end the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to our host.